Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's great to be with you this Friday afternoon where I am, maybe morning or evening where you are. Please take a minute, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not, support us on Patreon if you like the work that we do. And more importantly, share the conversation with people, share it with folks that you think would be interested in it. If you like it afterwards, share it with folks. They can watch it later on. Um, yeah, looking forward to this discussion today. We're going to be talking about a number of things, but in one ways, this is a kind of an initial response to discussing some of what the incoming Trump presidency might mean in terms of what rather than saying what foreign policy it'll be, what form of U.S. imperialism that we will have under the Trump administration, and how that might be similar or differ to other forms. And as always, I'm really excited to have our guest today. Really a fan of his work. Alexander Aviña is a historian and professor, also the author of the book Specters of Revolution, Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside. We're going to be talking about one of his pieces today, America is not America Yet, a title he said he did not choose, on American history and the history of the world. That is linked in the show description. It's a great piece, and we'll get into some of that as well as some other stuff he's working on, in terms of kind of thinking particularly about, both. Yeah, well, actually, I won't spoil too much of the conversation. I'll let us just get into it. So, Alex, welcome to the show, man. It's good to be with you again.
Hey, what's up, Jay? Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, always a pleasure, yeah, indeed. Um, and also, if people haven't checked them out, I put them in the show description. But we've had three really good conversations over the last year that I encourage people to check out. One on Latin America, Palestine, Zionism, Israel's role within Latin America historically. Another one on border fascism, which is kind of in many ways, I think, a prelude, or has some themes that we'll be talking about today for sure. And then the conversation on Lucio Campañas with yourself, and then David Chavez joined and co-hosted that. That was a lot of fun too. So anyways, I encourage people to check those out. The funny thing to me, I just have to say this quickly, is that every time, like, there's really nothing in the title of this show that should prompt YouTube to has to tell us that Donald Trump has been confirmed of the winner of the 2024 election. But this is just like the state of YouTube, is that I guess we put America first in quotes or something, and they said, oh, we have to make sure people know that we're not spreading disinformation about the election.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well, because
um
disinformation determines electoral results, so we have to be careful of unduly influencing elections, Jay.
Well, we wouldn't want to see a liberal January 6th. So
Oh my God. That would be
uh,
amazing. I think that's how we should
um,
end. We should come back to that and be like, "Hey, how would a lib January 6th look like?" I think that'd be kind of fun. But sorry, go ahead.
we should just do a whole episode on that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
bring back David. We should bring back David Chavez for that.
um, all right. So one of the themes that you explore in these pieces you're working on, and one that you've already published, is this kind of narrative of isolationism with regards to Trump. And I admit, like, there are aspects of this that I think work on my psyche and the way I think of things. And I've said stuff before on the show. People are like, "No, that's BS. Like, you shouldn't say that." Um, you know, uh, Partly it has to do with what my kind of back of the envelope analysis of what the first Trump presidency was. And I think there were one of the things we'll get into is like that what we might think of as maybe a bit of the withdrawal policy with regards to kind of Obama and Biden's and Bush, the wars, kind of the war on terror, a little bit, withdrawing a little bit from Syria and Afghanistan. Um, that and then also obviously he's criticized the war on Ukraine. You know, that there are some dynamics of his policy in the previous administration, at least, and I think it'll be really interesting to talk about some of the distinctions, because I think there are some distinctions we can already see in
Yeah.
terms of what this administration looks like and the people that are coming into it. Um, but one of the things that's, you point out in your piece and in your writing, and it's very true, is like that narrative really doesn't work also when we think about his first administration with regard to Latin America, because they had the maximum pressure sanctions on Venezuela, also in Cuba, and Marco Rubio, of course, was a big part of his Cuban policy, and now looks like he's going to be Secretary of State, which is like, man, just the worst. Um, so let's talk a little bit about kind of this dynamic and this idea of an isolationism or an America first, which you're really saying so much for that, and what these proposed appointments, that you're thinking about and writing about, what they seem to signal, in terms of what you think the policy of the Trump administration will be in Latin America, and the extent to which you think that's this, differs, or what you're thinking about with regard to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to get a Florida man foreign policy with regard to Latin America right now. That if the reports are accurate, Marco Rubio will be Secretary of State, and then this other guy, Mike Waltz, who's in the House of Representatives, former Green Beret. He's also from Florida. Very hawkish. Has said a lot of incendiary things since his short time. I mean, he's like really like a product of the war on terror, right? Elected from war on terror directly into the House of Representatives. And then if the reports continue to be accurate, we have another Florida man, Matt Gaetz, as Attorney General, right? So there's a couple ways to think about this. As a historian, I mean, this is like an obvious point for historians of Latin America and the Caribbean. And anytime we hear historians of the US use this term, we all kind of cringe and laugh and we kind of mock them. And this is when US historians say, they talk about isolationism as like an actually existing thing in US history. And for historians, usually the period that is marked as the isolationist period is sometime from, late, let's say 1909, 1910, 1911, around there, up until the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the early 1930s, right? And that's like the America First time. That's the isolationist period. And you have like well-respected normie historians of the US will say that's like the period that the US was isolationist. And historians of Latin America know that like during that time period, in the immediate aftermath of the Spanish-American War, the US invaded Latin America like 34 times. And they used the US Marines, and they used the Teddy Roosevelt's, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where he said, look, we are the police power in the hemisphere. And if we see quote unquote chronic wrongdoing and breakdown in civilization, it's a duty of the United States to intervene and to reestablish order. That order being protecting U.S. business and investments in the region, making sure that these Latin American countries were open to their markets were open to U.S. manufactured goods, but at the same time providing cheap natural resources for U.S. industrialization. So,
one second, Alex.
Yeah.
Your screen is frozen, it looks like. So I'm wondering if you could try just like probably could you turn your camera off and on and see if that does anything?
Oh, it's weird. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know why, but it is for the audience too. No, it's still frozen. That's weird. All right, maybe try logging out and logging back in. If we can't get it, we
Okay.
can just do it with audio, but yeah, let's see if that works. Sorry about that, folks. We will get this sorted out shortly, I'm pretty sure. As we're waiting, I'll just say that George Abdullah, who's the longest political prisoner in Europe. He's a Lebanese communist. A French court has approved his release. So I don't think technically he's out yet, but it's looking good. And he's been somebody that organizations like Sami Dune and others have, been fighting for a long time. Let's see. Um, yeah, just waiting to see if hopefully Alex can log back in. How's everybody doing? Let's see. I'm tag some questions. Just to clarify if this was a question, yes, that is what the YIMBY movement stands for. Backyard in this case is a reference to the Monroe Doctrine. All right, we seem to be good.
I'm back. Yeah. Sorry.
Right. Sorry about that.
Failed internet infrastructure in Arizona, but we're back.
No.
What was I saying? So sorry about that, everyone.
No, it's all good. You were up to like Roosevelt, I think.
Roosevelt, yeah. So again, this period, this idea that isolationism is like an actual existing thing in the past in U.S. foreign policy is a complete myth. And Latin Americans are the first one to tell you this. Folks in the Caribbean are the first ones to tell you this, right? Like the U.S. invaded Haiti in 1915 and occupied it until 1934. FDR used to brag that as a assistant secretary of the Navy that he personally wrote Haiti's new constitution. And part of rewriting that constitution was to allow foreign ownership of land, which had been prevented because of the Haitian Revolution and Haitian independence in the early 1800s. So, it's Latin Americans know very well that this isolationism has never existed. So anytime that, I remember thinking about this when Trump first was elected, his first presidential campaign, referring to America first as an isolationist policy, like we knew that was not correct. I mean, he might pull back from other areas that are deemed not vital or not, he wasn't interested into what he identified as foreign policy interests. But we know that whenever these gringos say isolationism, we know it's going to come back hard on Latin America and the Caribbean. And, this is the work of Greg Grandin, historian Greg Grandin, who's now at Yale, is really instructive on this. He has a great book that I use in my classes called Empire's Workshop. And in it, he says, look, Ronald Reagan used Central America in the 1980s as kind of like a ideological and actual battleground to suture together a political coalition on the right. So to bring together people, neocons, militarists, and evangelical, right-wing evangelical Christians together into this coalition. And because their interests all converged on beating back revolutionary movements in Central America in the 1980s, that they found common ground and were able to form a pretty formidable political coalition that also managed to undercut a lot of the working class support away from the Democrats to the Republicans. I wonder if we're going to see something similar in this second iteration of Trump. Like, I wonder if he will pull back from Ukraine or he will pull back from other parts. There's reports, I guess, that Elon Musk was secretly meeting with Iran, and conveying messages from Trump that they don't want to go to war. Like, I wonder that there's going to be a pullback somewhere else in the world. The U.S. empire will pull back, most likely maybe Ukraine, although both Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz are they're hawks when it comes to Ukraine. And Waltz has even called for U.S. boots on the ground, which is a terrifying thought. But I wonder if, going back to Grandin's thesis for Central America in the 1980s, like, I wonder if we'll see something similar. Like, I wonder if Trump and his advisors will use the Latin America and the Caribbean once again as a place where they can bring together a really unwieldy political coalition on the right. And I think it behooves us to politically analyze the different components of this coalition. It's not just one group, right, that's fueling him. It's a lot of different groups, and at times they have certain contradictions. But I wonder if they do engage in more interventionist policies in Latin America and the Caribbean, whether that will allow them once again to kind of stabilize this potentially unwieldy political coalition. And the people that he's picked, like Rubio, like Waltz. There's a guy right now, Carlos Trujillo, who's rumored to basically be in charge of foreign policy of the Western Hemisphere. He was ambassador to the Organization of American States during the first Trump administration. And he played a big role in delegitimizing the Bolivian electoral results in 2019 and helped contributed to the destabilization that led to the coup and the ouster of Evo Morales, to the point where he had to flee for his life and ended up in Mexico. Right. So the America First thing is obviously bullshit. And historically, to reiterate, whenever we see this type of idea being pushed, it just means that the U.S. empire is going to bear its fangs in relation to the Caribbean and Latin America. And certain countries, I think, will be in the crosshairs. I think Mexico certainly will be in one of those countries potentially, but definitely like Cuba and Venezuela, I think are going to potentially attract the most attention from U.S. empire.
Appreciate it. A couple things. Someone asks for a brief definition of isolationism as we're using it here. How would you describe that?
This idea that U.S. political leaders and policymakers have decided that it's time for the U.S. to withdraw from the world and to focus on internal dynamics and matters, which, for structural reasons and for political reasons and for imperial reasons, it's not possible, right? Whether it, especially now, right? Like, it might have been a little different in the early 20th century, but now you could say you're isolationist all you want, but we have the global reserve currency. Like, there's no way in practice that the U.S. could ever be isolationist. You can't. You have to go and protect the dollar. And part of that, to get to this point, we have to go back to the early 20th century, and they essentially tried this out on Latin America and the Caribbean first, regionally, before they expanded globally after World War II. So isolationism is just this idea that the U.S., when it comes to foreign policy, the U.S. retreats from the world stage, to use their language, and they're just focused on fixing the country internally, and they don't care that there's a World War I going on or a World War II going on. Like, they're just focused on themselves. And again, that's not a thing, even though it's pretty mainstream, common sense notion within U.S. history that, at least in the first part of the 20th century, the U.S. had a period of isolationism.
Yeah. And it also, I mean, especially in this point in time, like, we don't have, I mean, one of the things that the right will admit is that we don't have the manufacturing capacity that we used to have within this country. And so, I mean, and this, of course, if they go through the trade war with China, this will produce all kinds of, contradictions, and maybe we'll get into that at some point too. But,
Yeah.
The point being that the United States can't, like, reproduce itself. The people we can't within our country create and develop and grow the things that we need to actually sustain us as a country, based on all of the industrialization and all of those things that have happened over years, and just kind of the way neoliberal policy globally has moved so much production out into different sectors of the world, as an attempt to be able to get cheaper wages and produce things more cheaply, et cetera. And so, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why, United States can't truly just isolate itself. Yeah. So anyways,
I mean, another way to think about it is, like, they can say they isolate themselves, but they still have 800 military bases around the world. They're still occupying part of Syria. They're occupying Iraq. Like, come on, like, it's not like a serious proposition. But again, there is, like, this historical myth about it. And I think politically it's a useful idea, right? And I think Trump has made use of this idea twice now. It's obviously not accurate. It's not an accurate description of U.S. empire and its place in the world, but there is something appealing, apparently, to a big swath of American voters. This idea that, yeah, we do way too much around the world. I mean, they usually don't think about it in terms of empire, right? Like, I teach a class on U.S. empire, and the first day I'm like, all right, we're starting this class with based on the premise that the U.S. is an empire, and there's always pushback, like, what? No way. And then the rest of the semester is kind of like, here it is. But that idea does have a political utility, and especially in the aftermath of, like, the war on terror and the invasion of Iraq, like that it does have a certain utility for elections, but there's just no reflection. It's just not a real thing on the ground and in practice.
Right on. Yeah. And there's some other questions about Puerto Rico, but I'll wait for that. I think that would be an interesting thing for us to talk about a little bit later on. So let's see. I mean, let's take a minute and talk a little bit about Rubio and about these other figures. I mean, for folks who don't follow them that closely, and they're everywhere, so I don't know how, you'd miss, but like say a little bit about their designs and their like hard lines and what you see from them in terms of intentions and policy directions with regards to Latin America.
Yeah, I think the very selection of people like Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz should undermine the idea that there is anything as America first foreign policy. Like Marco Rubio, the first thing that I love reminding people is, I think it's really funny. Like Marco Rubio's political story is that his parents fled Cuba and came to the U.S. as exiles. But then when you dig into the story, his parents actually fled during the Batista dictatorship, not after the 1959 July 26th revolution. So that's all. I think that's an important thing, right? Like there's a lot of stolen valor, I guess, that he has exercised in his political story. But like he was like, he's a Florida man. He was a mediocre student, mediocre athlete who went to college, graduated, and then got involved in state politics. And Florida has a very particular idiosyncratic political culture because since the end of World War II, we've seen a series of revolutionary processes in Latin America. And when I'm not like, it's not a pejorative description of these people. I mean, I guess we could take it this way, but like objectively, like the losers of these revolutionary processes will leave their countries because they lost these revolutionary processes and they've gone to Florida. So like really Miami and South Florida is like the reactionary right-wing capital of Latin America. And you have successive waves of exiles who have nurtured this political culture with revanchist anti-communism that interfaces or mixes with local reactionary forms, anti-Black forms, anti-Indigenous forms, right? And it creates this political culture that is different in the sense that it's actually defined by outward developments. Whereas I think usually our idea is that like Americans are really provincial when it comes to like foreign policy. American voters don't care. It's not the case in South Florida, right? Because again, this political culture has been defined against what these people have fled, right? Whether it's the Cubans and all the different generations of exiles, Nicaraguenses, right? Like Ana Navarro, the CNN person who's, I guess she's a Democrat now, but like, in the 80s, she was in Florida bragging about how her dad was a Contra and she was fundraising for the Contras. Venezuelans that came after the Bolivarian Revolution. I mean, like Colombians, Brazilians. Bolsonaro was hanging out in Florida for a reason, right? So that's the kind of political culture that created someone like Marco Rubio. And as he entered state politics, he showed a knack for attaching himself to powerful political figures at the state level, and they raised them up really quickly. Like in a few years, just a few years after entering state politics, he was I remember if he's like the Speaker of the House or the Speaker of the Senate. I can't remember which one. And it's, again, he's attaching himself to these local political powerful figures. And eventually he finds himself in the Senate. But he's always been quote unquote a hawk when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. And his big thing with relation to Latin America is a virulent anti-communism. He's able to, as he did a couple years ago, he's able to go to El Salvador and witness the dictatorship that's been set up by Nayib Bukele and actually find a lot to extol, right? Like he loved what he saw in El Salvador under Bukele, and he came back and he published like this glowing op-ed about this dictatorial police state. But that doesn't stop him from then going and castigating Cuba or castigating Venezuela or Bolivia or any other governments that are deemed to be enemies of U.S. empire in the region. But that contradiction is like one of the markers, I think, of this Floridian political culture. So, I mean, he's always advocated for interventionist policies, usually like economic war and sanctions. And we'll see in this tenure, once he begins next year, if he's going to advocate again for more aggressive, direct interventions, perhaps even more so than we witnessed during the first Trump administration, because the first Trump administration did do some pretty shady things in Latin America. In addition to the Evo Morales thing, we did see this like farcical attempt to stage a coup d'etat in Venezuela, in which the Venezuelan fishermen were able to beat back these mercenaries, which is like some of the greatest scenes I've seen. So I mean, that's him, right? So we're getting like a virulent, revanchist, anti-communist perspective on Latin America and the Caribbean. And Marco Rubio and Waltz will go back. It's almost like an old Cold War, like Red Dawn mentality. They will show no compunctions about aligning themselves with authoritarian police states like Bukele, El Salvador, that he identifies as they identify as like friends to the U.S. And they will go after countries that they deem enemies to U.S. geopolitical designs in the region.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think this is one of the things too, like I had this conversation with Mikey where we talked, it was kind of like I think we called it an elections as counterinsurgency coda. But like we were just talking about how at the end of the elections, this thing of like, lumping people into these large demographic categories and then looking at like, what was their turnout in 2016, 2020, and 2024, right? And then this became a blame game. Of course, never a blame game about like white people and their like their voting patterns, but
they don't have identity politics.
There's no, yeah, exactly. We don't talk. That doesn't matter. But Latinos, right? This was the thing, and then of course, if you watch Fox News, it's Hispanics, right? But the category that they talk about is, you see these like, we've seen these horrible like viral memes of like people like, I'm gonna call ICE now because like Latinos have turned into Trump voters and stuff like that. And like that's exactly the kind of fratricidal like kind of crap that those types of takes are kind of designed to do, is to sort of turn people against each other. And imagine that these coalitions based on this vast like racial or ethnic category are somehow supposed to all be Democrat or whatever. And if they're not, then there's something wrong with them and we need to punish them. But it's like one of the big problems that I talked about with that is that like there's no class analysis in it. There's no analysis of like what Latinos, like from what countries and from in what states and in and I think like that you talking about like the Florida component is like a huge thing, because that there's a lot. Bernie Sanders, this was one of the things, is they like just branded him a communist and like it killed him across the South.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And so I think these are like the pieces of that too, that and it's not to say that people should vote some way because of who they are or anything like that, but that idea, again, it's to make people into these like monolithic things. It's like as if every Latino is a migrant that's fleeing right-wing violence. That's which a lot of them are, obviously. But anyway, I think that, I don't know if you had any comments on that, but I just
I totally forgot. I should have started off the show by apologizing for causing the Kamala Harris's defeat as a Latino and as a male. We are the ones who caused the defeat of the Democrat. Yeah, I mean, look, like we go through this every 2 to 4 years, Jay. Like some of us have to continuously remind journalists and political consultants that like there is no such thing as Latino, Latina, or Latinx. There isn't. And like as long as you keep viewing people through this monolithic lens, like you're going to continue to suffer the political consequences, right? 80%, and there is some utility of it, like the way I'm going to use it right now. 80% of Latinos in the US are working class, right? So there's one way to think about class, but then you have to think about locality. Like I grew up in California, with the exception of a couple of years that I lived in Mexico with my parents, when the dream of every migrant is not really to stay here, but it's to go back a little bit of money and like make it, right? But with the exception of that, I grew up in central Southern California, and like the way people identified there, people from my community, they would never use the word Hispanic, right? They would say Mexican or Mexican American or Chicano or whatever. And even then there was internal differences, like based on migration waves. Like my parents would be like, you're not a Chicano. Don't ever identify as Chicano. You're Mexican. The Chicanos are those people that came, they've been here for a long time. So there, even within our group, there was internal differences. And then my first teaching job after I finished graduate school, I moved from Los Angeles to Florida State University. And the vast majority of my students there did not use the identifier of Latino or Latina. No, they use Hispanic. And it didn't matter if they were Mexican, Dominican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, like there, because of this political culture, they use the term Hispanic quite consciously, right? Like to draw on the Spanish part of Latin American identity and to negate, indigenous and Black and Asian sources for that identity. So locality is extremely different. Like New Mexico is another like radically different situation there in terms of how people identify themselves there as Nuevo Mexicanos or Neo Mexicanos, whatever. Texas, the Texicans are a completely different case study, right? You have a county, Starr County, that had been voted Democrats, 97%, again, to use the term Latino that I'm railing against. But they've been voting Democrat since like 1896, and they went Republican for the first time, right? So there's something locally going on in the Rio Grande Valley of Southern Texas that might be different than what's happening in Southern California, that's happening where I live now here in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona versus what's happening in Florida. But like, we have to go through this shit every 2 to 4 years, right? And in this situation, we're getting blowback and we're getting these horrible videos. And by the way, don't call ICE on me, Jay. I have citizenship, so don't try that on me. We get to see these horrific videos, right? Like one after another, just horrible videos and takes of like, hey, amigo, I'm gonna call ICE on you because you voted for Trump. And then there's an equally, I think, worse version of this take being applied on Muslim Americans, Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, right? I think it's even is worse. So all to say, man, this analytic for political purposes, this Latino analytic, like doesn't do any work. And if anything, I think it does more harm than good when you're thinking about why people vote the way that they do. And we have to really go to the local, to the context, to national origin, to class, to gender, also to religion, right? Like there's a rising number of evangelical Latinas, right? And that's having a political impact. So we have to take that into account as well. And we're also not like single issue voters, right? Like not everyone cares about migration, which is another thing, right? Like, and if that were the case, then that doesn't explain the Democrats saying we're going to like shut down the border and kick all, like, it's just weird. It's really weird. The way that these diverse, heterogeneous group of people divided along the same axes of race, class, gender, religion, et cetera, get treated as a monolith with like caring about one or two issues is, again, we have to play this game every 2 to 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, and I absolutely, yeah, I don't want to, we could keep talking, we could go down a deep rabbit hole of the Kamala Harris campaign and all the ways that she ran on almost the exact same policies as Trump, and then people get blamed because they chose, the Coke as opposed to the Diet Coke, all right. So in one of the pieces that I wanted to talk to you about, this is the one that has the title was related to America, and we could talk about that a little bit. But there's this contestation over the term America that you talk about. You go into kind of the etymology and like, but also over what truly represents kind of an American anti-colonial spirit, which I found really interesting because obviously there's a lot of times very falsely we get taught of the United States as having this kind of anti-colonial history in a certain way because of the so-called Revolutionary War, right? And I found that interesting because, of course, obviously the work of like Gerald Horne, thinking about the counter-revolution of 1776, but also, he's really started to think about counter-revolution through a succession within the United States, thinking about it in Texas and so on too. And really thinking about this as not truly an anti-colonial thing at all, which obviously, of course, anybody who, is aware of indigenous people knows that it's not truly anti-colonial. And so talk a little bit about the divide, that you're looking at, because one of the things you're looking at is these kind of different forms of anti-colonial, kind of spirit or anti-colonial movements within the Western Hemisphere. within the Americas, quote unquote. And obviously there's a lot of different ones, and you kind of, give a little bit of a survey of them, but I'm more interested in kind of some of the different dynamics that you're looking at and examining in the piece that way.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to. I mean, maybe after this one, we can talk more about kind of like Horn's thesis, and because this is something that I think about a lot, right? And I thought about it a lot in writing this piece for like a really cool magazine. I've had a great experience writing for them called The Dial. Um, Thinking about what's redeemable in this like settler colonial project that we call the United States, right? Like I've read that trilogy, right, that Professor Horn put together, and it's a really interesting way, and you combine that with like the work of different Native scholars, and it completely reframes, it reframes a question, right? It goes beyond this question of like what is redeemable about the settler colonial project to something much more radical, and we can, if you want, we can come back to that. But in terms of this particular article, I was asked to kind of explore the history of the word or the concept of America, and I kind of give the longue durée history from, these like German cosmographers, this Italian quote unquote explorer, to German cosmographers, to the way that Spanish white settlers in the Americas started to reappropriate it and then use this concept of America to fuel different independence movements against Spain beginning in the early 19th century. And the idea of a republic America against like a monarchical Europe, monarchical Iberian Peninsula, monarchical Spain. And one of the things that I write about that emerges throughout the course of the 19th century is that slowly through popular struggle, through revolutionary struggle, who counts as a quote unquote American becomes, it becomes a much more expansive, radical concept, right? So even though it starts to acquire, it begins to, so to speak, with like an anti-imperialist core identity because it was forged against the Spanish colonizers. And then in the middle of the 19th century, when the gray-eyed man of destiny, William Walker, invades Nicaragua and he tries to set up his own southern slave state republic, the idea of America is nurtured by different forms of anti-imperialism. But throughout most of this 19th century, it remains like a very white identity, right? Like the American referred to the descendant of the settlers, of the Spanish settlers, of the Spanish colonizers, the people that would be called like the Creoles or the Criollos. But nonetheless, it still had the one like radical motivating potential in this identity, particularly after all these American shenanigans in Central America of the 1850s and late 1850s, is that anti-imperial aspect of it. So by the time we get to the 20th century, when we have massive global shaking social revolutions in places like Mexico, in places like Cuba, when you have these really important guerrilla movements that defeated the U.S. Marines in a place like Nicaragua with Augusto Cesar Sandino, the idea of America as an anti-imperialist concept starts to look more working class, more peasant, and darker skin. And it becomes like a more expansive revolutionary concept. But it begins with the idea that what America is, it's not what, the gringos tend to think of the America as being the United States. America as a concept to describe the entirety of the Western Hemisphere. Sometimes it includes the United States and Canada, sometimes it doesn't. To go on a bit of a tangent, there was in the 80s, there was a public art project in New York City where there was funding for artists to mess around with like electronic digital stuff. And there was a electronic screen in Times Square, and like the chosen artists would, for the week or the month or whatever, would be able to display their artwork on this like big, massive screen. And one of the guys who won in the 80s was a Chilean artist named Alfredo Jaar, and his whole series of like images that would pop up on this digital screen, electronic screen, was like, this is not America. Like to remind Americans that like what you guys think is America, this is not America. America is all of the Americas. And to think about, is there like an anti-imperialist revolutionary potential within this broad identifier? And by the time we get to the 20th century, you have, even before, with the people like Jose Marti and these Cuban revolutionaries who tried to achieve independence and were interrupted from doing so by the Americans. By the 20th century, like America as a Latin American identity, hemispheric wide, can be used to denote a revolutionary and anti-imperialist identity, and it's used from Mexican revolutionaries in the 1910s to especially the Cuban revolutionaries of the 1960s to the Nicaraguenses of the 1970s and 1980s to, Hugo Chavez was big into this, right? With the Bolivarian Revolution as well, that what constituted America was the entire region geographically, and the American, or actually the masses of these two continents, the workers, the peasants, the people of color, women, indigenous peoples, etc.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I guess, yeah, well, let's go to the horn point that you said we could talk about a little bit more. I would love to. What did you want to talk about with that? Or what is it that it most interests you about it?
Well, in this article, the title is drawn from Langston Hughes' poem, right? Like America Has Never Been America to Me. And it's a really interesting poem because it's decrying all the injustices, right, that are being perpetrated at the moment of writing that poem. Not just against Black Americans, right? But he's also talking about indigenous peoples, Asian peoples. So he's very clear about describing the injustice and the exploitation and the racism and the apartheid rule in the United States. But he still holds on to this, like, what is that idea that he's holding on to, right? For Langston Hughes, there's an America that has not yet been fulfilled or manifested into reality. And what is that idea, right? So part of me is like, well, I want to be respectful to what this brilliant poet was thinking about in the 1930s, 1940s. Like, where is he getting this idea of an America that's like inclusive, that is radical, that is revolutionary, that is not white supremacist, that is not subject to bourgeois rule at the end, based on the exploitation of workers and et cetera. Because part of me, like, maybe I'm just like super jaded, and it's a different moment in which I'm thinking about this question, where I'm like, is there really something redeemable about this place, about this project? Obviously, someone like Langston Hughes, and there's a whole generation of poets and writers and radical activists who do talk about this, right? Like, if only we could fulfill the
Baldwin kind of does.
Baldwin, if we could only actually fulfill the promise that this idea represents. And I'm thinking about, like, what does this idea represent? Like, how real is it? Or was it something that was just kind of, I guess as a historian, I probably shouldn't, I don't actually believe this, but was this like just fucked to begin with? Like, because it began as not a revolution of 1776, but it began as a counter-revolution, to go back to Horn's book, that I taught in a grad seminar once, and grad students were not very happy with it. The idea that, like, I think incontestable idea that this was a settler colonial project that gained its liberation against imperial overlords, because these settlers wanted to do things that the metropole didn't want them to do, right? To expand west, to take over indigenous lands, to go south into Spanish Florida and cause, ruckus there. Because from the very beginning, like, if you read these like Puritan ministers that are writing, like Cotton Mather and others in the 1600s, from the beginning, their idea is like, we're going to expand southward. We're going to go west, but we're definitely going to go south. Like, I think it was Cotton Mather who talked about how they were going to go all the way to Mexico City and create a new Jerusalem, a new Zion. So that shit's like baked in, right? So if that's the case, then, and if this began as a counter-revolution, then like, what I guess, like, one way to think about it is like, what can we build on it? And I don't know, maybe I don't have an answer. Like, I'm still thinking through and thinking with people like Langston Hughes, who do see a certain idea. Aziz Rana has a book that's really interesting that talks about how he does make the argument that there is something here about, in this American ideology, about self-rule and freedom of the individual. The problem is it's always been a white form that's predicated on the domination and exploitations of non-white peoples. So how do you escape that, right? You can't escape that by just slowly opening the categories and then allowing, brown faces in high places or black faces in high places, right? The structure of domination is still there. So I don't know. I don't, it's just something that I was struggling with as I wrote this article, because I think the conclusion is like pretty bleak, right? Like, I wrote it before the election, and like, in there, I talk shit about this politics of joy, and I'm talking about the genocide in Gaza, and I don't see any potential for political change electorally. And I made a point about, where I see the potentials out in the streets, right? It's with the students who bravely took on their universities last spring. I mean, I still have students who are suspended. I have a student who is going to be suspended until late next year or 2026. It's fucking ridiculous. Like, so I don't know. Maybe it's just a particularly bleak time when I was writing this, and I was like really embracing the Horn thesis of like, man, this was messed up from the beginning, and there's not much here to build on. But then I think of people in the past like Hughes, like W.B. Du Bois, right? Thinking about Black Reconstruction and abolitionist democracy. Like there are these glimmers of hope in the past that I think I'm trying to hold on to, and I'm trying to think through to kind of chart out a political path in the present. And it has to be people like Langston Hughes, like Claudia Jones, like W.B. Du Bois's ideas on abolition democracy that I think are good, like Gerald Horne, right? Like I think of the work of people like Nick Estes. Like I think there are some really good stuff out there that we can use to kind of chart a political path in the present. And I think maybe like the final point in this article, and I'll stop blabbering, is going back to that Alfredo Har point, the Chilean artist. Like maybe this starts by recognizing that this, where we live now, this is not America. There's nothing special about this place. This is not America. The idea, the concept was always hemispheric wide, and in its best iteration of it, it was anti-imperialist, it was revolutionary, it was leftist, and it was led by the people.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I know we'll get into some more of this as we kind of dig through the piece, but I appreciate those comments. So, one of the things you do in the piece too is you kind of look back and you sort of look at how did we get to what gets known as the Monroe Doctrine, which we probably should make sure, again, as we're using different terms, that folks know what the Monroe Doctrine, actually referred to. But I think it's an interesting, I appreciated that because I hadn't really, and you kind of alluded to a little bit of it there with like the Cotton Mather and stuff like that. But, I didn't really, I guess, think that much about that when I learned about the Monroe Doctrine. I was just like, okay, like this is, it was an imperial kind of policy, but like, I think it is kind of important to understand that it doesn't just like come out of nowhere. It's not, it arrives with this kind of ideological base to it. So walk through a little bit of that history, which you lay out in the piece.
Yeah. So the Monroe Doctrine is an address to, I think it was like, I'm going to mess up some of the specifics, but it was I think it was an address to Congress that President James Monroe articulated in 1823. And it was within the context of these different Latin American independence movements who were fighting against Spain. And Monroe writes this what now is known as a doctrine, where he basically says like, America for the Americans and Europeans stay out. And America is going to be an area of Republican self-rule against like old monarchical Europe. And the United States will not tolerate the presence of European imperial powers in the Americas, and that these Latin Americans should have the right to kind of determine their path. And if they want independence, they should do so. But, and Latin American, like these people, these revolutionary, well, some were revolutionary, some were not, but these people who are fighting for independence from Spain, like they took this idea seriously. They're like, oh, the US is on our side, right? They're the first ones to have gotten independence from a European country. They obviously, despite some really direct connections between Haiti and some of these efforts, like Haiti was not looked down. We can talk about that if you want as an example to follow. Right. It's way too radical for a variety of reasons. So people like Simón Bolívar, like initially viewed the Monroe Doctrine as like a positive thing. Like, whoa, we're going to create, again, thinking about the America as a broad continental region, being identified Republican rule, anti-monarchical, respecting the self-determination of people, et cetera, et cetera. But like, it's even before this thing gets promulgated, you have famous people, famous political figures in the US like John Quincy Adams, like completely denying the ability of Latin Americans to self-rule, particularly democratic self-rule. So he has I don't remember if I cite this in this piece or another piece, but he has a quote where he more or less says like the idea of democracy and self-rule in Latin America, in Spanish America, as he calls it, is as ridiculous as thinking that like beasts and birds can like rule themselves, something like that. And that's that's in the that. Yeah. Okay. That gringo refusal to acknowledge the capacity of Latin Americans to engage in revolutionary or democratic self-rule. That's like a long through line, right? Of 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries of US Latin America relations, from John Quincy Adams quote in the 1810s to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 to, George Kennan, who is like the architect of the Cold War, the containment and all that. He does a tour of Latin America in 1950, and he comes back and he's like, these people are horrible. They can't engage in any type of democratic self-rule. They're backward. They're incapable racially or in other ways. So that's like a pretty constant amongst U.S. Grand strategists and political leaders and policymakers throughout the last 2 centuries. So the Monroe Doctrine, the way it develops in the course of the 19th century is that the U.S. uses it to justify it acting as a police imperial power in the region, and particularly by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, when the U.S. has become in the midst of a industrial revolution, it's becoming a really powerful entity. It uses the Monroe Doctrine to intervene in the internal affairs of its Latin American neighbors over and over and over and over again. And then Roosevelt adds his corollary in the early 1900s, around the time that the U.S. helps Colombia's northernmost province kind of separate itself into an independent country so it could then provide a canal for the U.S. I'm talking about Panama. That's when he adds his corollary. I totally messed it up. Corollary. And that's the one I referenced earlier, right? We said the U.S. not only is the Americas for the Americans, the gringos, but we are also the regional police power, and we're going to intervene when we see fit. And like the one historical example that I use a lot with my students is that after the Spanish-American War in Cuba was nominally independent, but the only way the Cubans got the American military forces to leave, at least temporarily, because they would be back several times, was to include the Platt Amendment into their Cuban constitution. And the Platt Amendment essentially said, look, this gives the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs anytime it deems it fit or necessary. And that's kind of like a national example of what the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine looks like in Latin America. And it goes on to justify a bunch of different interventions. And Marco Rubio, going back to Marco Rubio, he's a big fan of the Monroe Doctrine. And he has said things like, we need the reinstitution of the Monroe Doctrine, as if it ever left. I don't think it ever left. Biden famously said that Latin America was not our backyard, it's our front yard. And this is why in the article that I sent you, no, we're back to the backyard now. And you have people like Rubio who fully believe in the Monroe Doctrine, and they want a Monroe Doctrine that's more openly honest and direct about its intentions. They're not going to worry about some of the highfalutin rhetorical justifications for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the big like anti-communist aspect of it, which, never obviously the Cold War, there was certain justifications of this, but like it never stopped. I mean, the U.S. antagonism to really most often it's social democracy that we're talking about, but to left-wing governments in Latin America is an ongoing thing, and it's like sabotaged again and again and always attacked in different ways. So
the anti-communism part was during the Cold War was definitely seen as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, because it's always represented as Bolshevism as an import from far away, right? Like an Eastern thing. Even though, as you rightly note, like most of these, all of them, these political reform efforts of Latin America, they begin in the late 40s. They're all social democratic efforts, right? A lot of them are inspired by the New Deal. A lot of them are inspired by to quote the Guatemalan president, Juan Jose Arevalo, he said, we are socialists because we live in the 20th century. The idea that like, okay, we have the economic capacity then and productive capacity to like allow everyone to live a life of dignity, a life of where their needs are satisfied and their these were social democratic efforts. But the anti-communism of the U.S. during the Cold War was to represent these things as like Bolshevik interference from exterior, use the Monroe Doctrine to justify things like the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, in 1954, or the famous incident of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. And we have that infamous quote of Henry Kissinger saying, why should we let a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people? And then he continues, he says, some issues are just too important to be left to Chilean voters. And I think I have that almost like that quote is like tattooed into my brain, right? Because in many ways it describes the Monroe Doctrine. It encapsulates like a broad history of U.S. empire in Latin America.
Yeah, and some of the modern iterations of this that you see too is like the way that they will use the kind of war on terror rhetoric um or things like connections to terrorism, right? I mean, even this is still like what Cuba is still like on this list of state sponsors of terror, which is like, I mean, to have Cuba on that list as like the United States is like arming, you know, uh, the so-called state of Israel to the teeth to commit genocide is like, enough of an irony to make your eyes roll back in your head.
Yeah.
But the they'll use these things of saying, they talk about the influence of China, of course, now a lot in Latin America as well as in Africa, but also talk about Iran and then even in certain periods you can find this, especially from like Rubio and Cruz and stuff like that. They'll talk about Hezbollah with
Yeah.
relation to like Venezuela and stuff like this. It's
Yeah.
just like a fascinating, like, it's like they're just like pulling, they're just like looking for things to be able to like make these connections to drop, justifications for sanctions often and things like this,
Totally. Yeah, before Hezbollah, there was the PLO, and during Reagan's effort to destabilize the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, one of the things that the Reagan administration used a lot was to say, look, the PLO's presence in Nicaragua and the relationship between Yasser Arafat and the Sandinistas demonstrates that there's some sort of like Kremlin, Middle Eastern terrorist Sandinista connection. And they actually did things like try to invent like anti-Semitic pogroms and shit like that to kind of scare U.S. domestic support away from the Sandinista revolution, because you did have like hundreds of thousands of Americans who would go in solidarity and do everything from teach to serve as doctors to just serve as human shields to protect Nicaraguan communities from the attack of these death squads called Contras. That's like one of the early iterations of it. The war on terror stuff goes kind of nuts. Well, even before, like in the 1990s, you had the embassy bombing in Argentina that gets blamed on the Iranians. But then the war on terror stuff, you really start to see people, Florida-based politicians especially, start to say, "Oh, Latin America has a pretty big diaspora, Arab diaspora or Palestinian diaspora, or whatever, Syrian diaspora. It must be a fertile ground for some of these transnational terrorist organizations." And after the war on terror, you had all sorts of crazy theories that were being spun by Florida-based politicians, right? The idea that Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda, they flattened the difference, right? Like they see them all as one thing, and they would say, "Oh, they're working with MS-13 and the Sinaloa cartel." And it's just like, what the like? It makes no sense. But you see like the coming together of like war on terror stuff with like war on drug stuff, and then using that to castigate certain countries that they are, particularly during the pink tide moment, that are deemed as enemies to the U.S. empire, right? So that's what Venezuela gets blamed for, being a conduit to Hezbollah terrorism, for instance, or actually Bolivia under Evo Morales as well gets blamed. Or there's certain regions of the South America, like this area where Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil kind of come together, and it's represented as like a lawless zone full of Muslim diasporic communities, and of course there's some sort of Islamo-fascist terrorism being festered that is going to come to the U.S., right? So what we see now is just built on these previous waves of U.S. imperial freaks who are trying to make connections between revolutionary Latin American movements or governments, linking them to enemies like the PLO, to other enemies, and then kind of throwing them together in this hodgepodge that will allow them to just wage endless war against them. And this is what we see. It's really like the 2000s, the early 2010s when this stuff really comes out. And that's where someone like Marco Rubio really begins to thrive politically.
Yeah, if folks ever want to read like the most kind of mind-bending, illogical set of books, just read like terrorism studies books that are written by people who are like within like
or don't do it. Save yourself some like sanity.
I'm just saying, like, if you want to drive yourself crazy, like, because it's just wild. I mean, there's so many weird, it's like it's like a projection of every like psychological like
That's what it is.
idiosyncrasy of the author
That's what it
like
is.
onto the page. Like,
That's what it
it's
is.
wild.
Yeah, I mean, when
Um,
they would blame the Sandinistas for fueling Palestinian terrorism by supporting the PLO, at the same time that they're doing this, Israel is sending tens of thousands of AK-47 rifles that it stole from the PLO in Lebanon and sending those to Honduras, where these death squad contras were training and launching their attacks from, into Nicaragua. So they were using AK-47 rifles that had once belonged to the PLO, but Israel had taken them after they invaded Lebanon and then given them to the contras. Like, it is projection, and obviously we've seen a lot of projection in the last year or so with this horrible genocide in Palestine and the bombing of Lebanon.
yeah, 100%. So one of the things that you do start to draw out is obviously we've talked a little bit about the different, the sort of republic against the monarch kind of anti-imperial sentiment. And we've talked about, some of the differing ways that that looked within, the Spanish New World, so-called. But there is this anti-US sentiment that does develop even as you write, even before the Mexican American War. So could you talk a little bit about some of the roots of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you had certain political leaders in the region started to become highly suspicious of U.S. intentions in the region. Some of this had to do with what happens with Texas, right? The way that Texas broke away from Mexico in the 1830s, and it was really this was like an early filibuster expedition, and at large, right? That allowed these American white, often slave-owning white Americans who had migrated into Texas to do regime change and to split off, right? And to create their own little newly independent republic that lasts for 9 years. And again, Horn's book on Texas is really good. And now anytime I see something bad happen in Texas, I blame Lopez de Santa Anna. It's all his fault. But you do have these like filibuster expeditions where you essentially it's like U.S., many from the South, right? Like the historian Walter Johnson, in one of his books, talks about how the class structure in the South was so ossified that it left little space for like a middle class, it prevented certain classes of white men for any sort of social economic mobility. So one of their outlets was to like become filibusters and try to like almost like a gringo version of a conquistador, and then you go off into the Caribbean or Latin America and you try to strike your riches there. But really by the 1840s, and especially after what happens in the U.S. invasion of Mexico and taking between 1/3 to 1/2 of Mexican national territory, that's like the first huge warning sign. And you have intellectuals in Latin America like Francisco Bilbao talk about how, look, we are not like the United States. They are obviously different from us. They started questioning its anti-colonial credentials, as they should have, and they did. And that then started to create an identity in the Americas that kind of left the United States out because it was acting like any other European empire was acting. It just had like a different origin story, but it was more or less the same thing. And as I talk about in the article, the moment that really marks the emergence of usually when people talk about the emergence of Latin America as a political identity, they cite Napoleon III's invasion of Mexico in the 1860s, right? This is where we get Cinco de Mayo. Like, Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican independence, is when the Mexicans won one battle against Napoleon III's troops outside in the outskirts of Puebla in 1862. And they usually talk about Napoleon III as being the one saying, hey, he's trying to distinguish a quote unquote Latin empire from the Anglo-American empire. And by saying all these Latin peoples, Southern European peoples have something in common. And then he's usually credited with the idea of inventing something called Latin America. But I think historians of Latin America have shown more conclusively that this idea had actually preceded Napoleon's intervention in Mexico. And it's in the 1850s with American filibuster expeditions in Central America, where people really started to form a Latin American identity distinct from the American and being anti-imperialist in nature against the interventionist Americans, and not necessarily making a distinction between these private mercenary filibusters who, like William Walker, he was actually, the first time he went, he's actually invited by a certain political faction in Nicaragua and then does this thing. So it's actually before Mexico's resistance against the French and Habsburg invasion that you already start to get a Latin American identity that is anti-imperialist. But again, it's identified with a certain Creole class or Creole group of people, like white descendants or descendants from the original settlers of the Americas. And that's one of its issues. And this is just in general, this is a longstanding issue of state formation in 19th century Latin America, like who counts as a citizen and who doesn't. Most of these countries are, to quote one historian of Peru, they're theoretical republics, right? In the sense that like you have a republic, but you don't have any citizens because most of the citizens are brown, dark skinned, indigenous, racially mixed, and the white state makers don't want to have anything to do with them. And it's going to take a lot of popular struggle, sometimes well into the 20th century, for the masses of Latin America to finally become like actual existing citizens and members of their national communities and gain any sort of economic, social, and political power. But the 1850s are seen as going back to your original question, Jay, the 1850s are seen as that origin point of something that we can start to see as a anti-imperial Latin American identity against the Americans. And it's only going to intensify as the U.S. continuously intervenes in the region. There's like a moment of respite because of the U.S. Civil War. But once that's resolved, it's going to be unfettered intervention and meddling from the late 1860s up until, let's say, Franklin Delano Roosevelt announces that the U.S. is finally going to be a good neighbor and they're not going to unilaterally military intervene in the region.
I want to go back to something you said earlier because you talked about Haiti as too radical of an example, of a revolution in the region. And yeah, I mean, I we've done episodes and talked about that history, so we don't have to like lay it all out, but maybe say a little bit more about what you mean by that and, how it might differ from the other revolutions of the period in the Western Hemisphere.
I think to this day, the Haitian Revolution remains the most radical, far-reaching revolutionary movement in Latin American history. And actually, I'm teaching a Latin American revolutions class this semester, and students usually wonder like why we start with Haiti. Because for one, sometimes for a long time, it was a habit of Latin Americans to not even include Haiti as a part of Latin America, whether it's because it's in the Caribbean, whether because it's Black, whether because they speak French and Creole, right? Like it's not seen as part of quote unquote Latin America. But in general, this successful slave insurrection that turns into a independence movement that achieves the first modern independent Black state in the Americas, it was anti-capitalist, it was anti-racist, and it was anti-slavery. And that, to my mind, that still continues to be a extremely radical revolutionary project to this day. It was anti-capitalist because the entire economy of this country, well, most of the economy of this French colony turned independent country was sugar production. They produced the vast majority of sugar in the world. Sugar was the lifeline of an Atlantic world capitalist economy that also depended on African slave labor. And once this revolution knocked that out, I mean, it was anti-capitalist. It wasn't explicitly anti-capitalist, right? It's not using that language, but in practice and in effect, it was, because it radically attacked one of the foundations of this capitalist economy that existed in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Obviously, it was anti-racist because they got rid of racial hierarchies and distinctions. To be a Haitian citizen was to technically be Black, and everyone was Black. Obviously, throughout the course of the 19th century and even before, there's going to be internal divisions, right, between the descendants of slave peoples and the descendants of free people of color. But it was an anti-racist revolution. And it was anti-slavery, right? So slavery is going to thrive in the Americas almost 100 years after the Haitian independence movement of revolution and independence of 1804, right? Like Brazil is not going to abolish slavery until like the late 1880s, Cuba in the mid 1880s, and then in third place it was the U.S., right? So to say, not just to say that slavery was outlawed forever in Haiti, but then to provide safe haven to Latin American revolutionaries like Simón Bolívar, and then making him promise, right, we'll give you soldiers, we'll give you arms and munitions, but if you succeed against Spain, you have to abolish slavery. Like they were they had that type of mentality as well. They were very self-aware of what their island, what their new nation represented as a radical revolutionary project. As I tell my students, the thing is, perhaps they were a little early, right? About 150 years too early. Because when you read the history, it's a fascinating history that I'm obsessed with. And I wish I had language skills and maybe I'd become a historian of the Haitian Revolution. But it was so far ahead of its time. And in a way, it suffered for it. And it continues to suffer for it. It's continually punished for being this extremely radical, to the point where like someone like anthropologist Michel Rothschild will say it was so radical in its time that it was an unthinkable revolution. Like not even the most leftist of French revolutionaries at that time could envision that Black slaves organized on their own under the noses of their slaveholders, and then launched this massive slave insurrection that decimated one of the world's, if not the world's wealthiest colony at the time. But the issue of Blackness, right? One of the unintended consequences of the Haitian Revolution was that it scared the shit out of other whites in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the irony of you get liberation and freedom in Haiti actually fortifies other slave regimes, plantation slave regimes in the Americas. And that's right. When we get to the Latin American independence movements, these Latin American elites who want to break away from Spain, they're trying to do so without sparking a social revolution in their future countries. And Haiti's kind of the example of not to follow. Right? They talk about not trying to spark a race war, because then when a race war happens, then they would say, we're going to find ourselves dead or expelled. And Haiti is used as a specter to kind of discipline and coerce some of the more radical elements of some of these independent movements. The only other independence movement that we could categorize as a revolution, because it included the masses of mixed race and indigenous members of these former Spanish colonies, was in Mexico. And actually that first effort was defeated, and what emerges as Spanish independence or Mexican independence is something radically different. But Haiti will be invoked by local and regional elites to be like, see, this is what happens when we give Black people rights. I mean, they'll use that language, right? And they will view themselves as kind of like enlightened white elites who are always looking toward Europe or the United States for examples or for emulation. And they have more of a relationship with Europe or the United States with their own citizen. That's going to be a constant throughout the 19th century. But Haiti remains that really dangerous subversive example. And I think in many ways it still does, as we see what's happening to it today, right?
I love this comment too. Haiti is also still being punished for daring to rename the island by its indigenous name, the only place in the Americas to do so, thereby permanently reminding folks it is stolen land. That's a nice point. And you do reference that in the article too, that it's the indigenous name of the place.
Yeah, the successful leader of Haitian independence, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a former slave, he has a great quote where he says, "I have avenged America." And I love that quote, right? Like the idea that him and his movement had not just achieved the liberation of a former French colony into a newly independent Black nation that named itself using the indigenous name for the island, but the idea that they had avenged all of the Americas, right? That they had struck back at a broader history of enslavement, dispossession, exploitation, and essentially genocide. It's a really cool quote because it shows that he was very well aware of like the historical significance of the movement that he led at the moment that he was doing that. And I think that's it's a really powerful idea. And in using the word America and the concept, right, he's using it in a revolutionary way as well, right? So going back to what we talked about Langston Hughes, I think it's really interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to read a quote from you. You write, "If the current political discourse, particularly around migration and refugees, is any indication, these civilizational divides remain alive and well. And the truth is that indigenous America, Black America, and Latin America are all here in the United States. They have always been, their land, their labor, their cultures, their dreams, their hopes," end quote. And so I thought this was a really powerful and interesting kind of part of the discussion in the piece. Because there's absolutely this mythology that somehow the United States is like not a part of the continents. I mean, it's so funny because part of the Monroe Doctrine, right, is sort of that like we are, that this is our hemisphere and we're a part of it and we're the protector of it and we're going to defend it against these so-called external threats and things like this. But the reality is that, you know, most people in the United States don't think of themselves as really a part of something that could be called the Americas. Like, they are America, you know. And so, you know, I think that that's a
Sounds
really
like another
important
settler
distinction.
colony that's in the news.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, as you know, like, this is a product of these kind of civilizational
Yeah.
divides, these kind of weird, like, religious and philosophical discourses
Yeah.
that emanate with in Europe, and they come with the white settlers, the Europeans. So say a little bit more about how we might think about, you know, what you're trying to think about in terms of these alternatives to these civilizational divides or the divides themselves.
Yeah, no, in terms of the divides, I think this is one of the political and historical functions of a place like the US-Mexico border. Like, I think US for a long time, US policymakers and political leaders have represented the US-Mexico border as a civilizational border between America as a white shining city upon a hill that looks toward Europe for its sources and inspirations, and then like a messy land south of it that's characterized by war, violence, revolution, poverty, exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. And this, you know, throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s, you'd have U.S. congressmen talk about the U.S.-Mexico border being like our Maginot Line, right? Like, this is our last defense against the hordes from the global South, quote unquote hordes from the global South or from Latin America coming into a white country. And like, the crazy thing is, if you read a lot of this stuff, it's a lot. One of the things that Trump did is to bring back some of this stuff out into the open and out into political discourse, because some of this discussion was limited to certain political quarters, but it was also like present in academic debates, right? Like Samuel Huntington, that was his whole thing. Like, he has an article that he published in, I don't know if it was Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy in the early 2000s, definitely after war, definitely after 9/11, called like the Hispanic Challenge. And in that article, he's like, the United States is a Protestant white nation, and Hispanic immigration to the country is going to destabilize that identity for the worse, because these people don't know how to assimilate. They actually are unable to assimilate. They don't want to, and they're incapable of, and they're going to bring down what the United States is as a white Protestant nation. This guy's like a Harvard. I mean, depending on how you look at it, you could say, of course, this Harvard social scientist who made a career out of, you know, helping counterinsurgency in Southeast Asia, or writing about the quote unquote clash of civilizations after the so-called end of history. But there's been a lot of effort, intellectual, academic, and political effort to use the Mexico border as a civilizational demarcation between what the United States supposedly represents, or what it thinks of itself, versus the rest of the hemisphere that it tries not to be a part of, or at the very least, it tries to be a part of it on its own terms, and that is as an imperial overlord that's meant to dominate and to exploit and to discipline these peoples who they historically have continuously represented as incapable of self-rule. Therefore, they need an empire. But then in that line that you read, I was also thinking of like in how the idea of borders functions internally, right? So you have internal borders within the United States that I think serve a similar function. Race serves a similar function. Like, racial formations within the U.S. form a similar function. Actual borders between Native American reservations and United States communities serve a similar function. So I don't know, man. I don't have like a straight answer for it, but I am thinking about how border and bordering is used internally to demarcate civilizational divides, while we have a big, 2,000-mile long actual border with Mexico that's used in the same way. But the one in the north is not, because I guess Canada and the United States are kindred spirits, and they are in many different ways. So, but regardless of this like white settler colonial imperialist mindset, these folks have always been here, right? I have a friend, Rosina Lozano, who teaches, I think she teaches at Princeton now. We went to graduate school together, and she has a really cool book on like the history of the Spanish language in the United States. And the Spanish language precedes the United States in this geographical area that we now refer to as the United States. Like, it's older, right? It's been here since the 1500s. So way before the counter revolution of 1776, to go back to Gerald Horne's formulation. Obviously, Native American peoples have been here from the beginning, man. They were here way before. And that's why you had people like Thomas Jefferson try to engage in like scholarly investigations to say that the Native American peoples in the Americas actually hadn't been around that long. And therefore that justifies their displacement. I mean, there's all sorts of weird shit that guy was engaged in, as we now know. So yeah, I think just thinking about the idea of borders and bordering as a process that's working simultaneously toward the external, but then also working internally in how it structures U.S. racial and class formations to maintain a particular form of exploitation and political power. And in a way, like I think what Trump does is he makes these borders more visible. I think Democrats in power try to like make them less visible with their rhetoric, with some of their policies, extremely limited reforms, with their ability to put brown and black faces in high places. But what Trump has done, and it will continue to do, is to really make those borders more visible. And he's gonna, and if he goes through with some of his promises, like mass deportations, I mean, he's really going to make these things materialize and be very apparent to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I was gonna ask a question about his higher ed policy, but I'm actually just gonna apologies in advance to the audience.
Send help.
But
Send help.
I'm going to actually play the clip. So if people don't want to listen to Donald Trump talk for 2 minutes and 26 seconds, then just go, get a cup of coffee or something like that, and we'll be back to talk about it in a second here. So, all right. What an ugly man. All right.
Tuition costs at colleges and universities have been exploding. And I mean, absolutely exploding. While academics have been obsessed with indoctrinating America's youth, the time has come to reclaim our once great educational institutions from the radical left, and we will do that. Our secret weapon will be the college accreditation system. It's called accreditation for a reason. The accreditors are supposed to ensure that schools are not ripping off students and taxpayers, but they have failed totally. When I return to the White House, I will fire the radical left accreditors that have allowed our colleges to become dominated by Marxist maniacs and lunatics. We will then accept applications for new accreditors who will impose real standards on colleges once again and once and for all. These standards will include defending the American tradition and Western civilization, protecting free speech, eliminating wasteful administrative positions that drive up costs incredibly, removing all Marxist diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucrats, offering options for accelerated and low-cost degrees, providing meaningful job placement and career services, and implementing college entrance and exit exams to prove that students are actually learning and getting their money's worth. Furthermore, I will direct the Department of Justice to pursue federal civil rights cases against schools that continue to engage in racial discrimination and schools that persist in explicit unlawful discrimination under the guise of equity will not only have their endowments taxed, but through budget reconciliation, I will advance a measure to have them fined up to the entire amount of their endowment. A portion of the seized funds will then be used as restitution for victims of these illegal and unjust policies that hurt our country so badly. Colleges have gotten hundreds of billions of dollars from hardworking taxpayers, and now we are going to get this anti-American insanity out of our institutions once and for all. We are going to have real education in America. Thank you.
Wow. I always make the joke that I really wish that I lived in the world that these people imagine that they live in, where there's this incredibly well-funded Marxist education system that has Marxist accreditors ensuring the Marxism within.
Oh, I don't know, man. I look at him and I'm like, it's so perfect that this guy's president of the United States. Like everything he embodies, represents, and like how he physically looks is so perfect. Look, I mean, obviously, hopefully I still have a job a year from now, because I guess I'm one of those Marxist lunatics or whatever else he said, maniacs. Yeah, I wish, yes, I totally agree, Jay. I wish their fantasies were actually something that existed in practice. It's, when they talk about indoctrination, it just reflects like just a willful ignorance of what education and teaching actually looks like. I always joke with people that I can't even get my students to read the syllabus. So how am I indoctrinating them? The one thing this seemed interesting is he's going to go after these administrators. They do drive up costs, right? Sometimes professors get blamed unjustly for driving up college costs. No, it's actually like middle management. So that would, I don't know, maybe he's only talking about like DEI bureaucrats or whatever language he used, but like, the neoliberalization of American universities has created this middle management class within universities, private or private. And like, they get paid a lot of money and they have big staffs, and we're not entirely sure of what they actually do. So I don't know, that might be interesting, but everything he described is like, I'll put it this way, like his attack on higher ed has been handed over to him by Democrats. Like everything he's described is a consequence of the neoliberalization of higher education that has happened in the United States since, let's say, the 1980s, especially 1990s, right? This idea that like hundreds of billions of hardworking Americans' taxpayer dollars have gone to universities. I mean, like that's simply, at least, in my, a humble public university, like we get almost no funding anymore from our state government. Like they've systematically have cut our state funding to that's a tiny percentage now, maybe 10%, maybe it's between 5 and 15% of our overall budget comes from the state. In a state like Arizona, in which its constitution says that higher ed education should be free for the people of Arizona. And that this really starts happening after the Great Recession of 2008. They use that as an excuse, right? Like kind of like a shot doctrine of implementing austerity on public universities. And that forces public universities to not be public universities anymore, because we then have to go out and find private sources of money. So my university has all sorts of relationships with, I would say, nefarious private and public actors, whether it's defense contractors, whether it's Department of Defense contracts. When the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians occurred, our university president was bragging that our university had a hand in developing the Javelin missile. It's just like, okay. The same university president who then goes to Israeli universities to accept awards, and he doesn't say anything about that. That's like totally cool. So yeah, I mean, it's like someone like Chris Rufo wrote that speech for him. It takes us back to Florida. It takes us back to this horrific experiment that they're enacting on the new college, right? New College of Florida, where they've turned it into like a Hillsdale of the South by purging faculty, purging students, destroying, really essentially restoring like an excellent university in Florida. And the way he's talking, it seems to me like someone like Chris Rufo probably wrote that speech because that's like their fever dream for American education. And at the one hand, they're saying we're going to get rid of the Marxists because they're indoctrinating. But then the only thing we want to teach then is like Western civilization and American tradition, which is, we could read that as another form of indoctrination. So, they really don't care about education. They don't care about students. What they care about is a particular form of power. And what they want is, again, they want to attack the very few things we have left in this country that are somewhat public or somewhat built for the common good. Even though, again, some of these public universities have a long nefarious history because many of them are land grant universities, and that was based on the displacement and disposition of native lands. Not Arizona State. That's to make that clear. That's University of Arizona here in Arizona. But yeah, I mean, it's just this is a worse, angrier, more fanged version of discourse that I have heard from technocrats at my university and from Democrats like Arne Duncan, who just use like a nicer language to describe a similar process.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. There's a convergence. I mean, higher education obviously has been under attack in a lot of ways, like you said, going back a long time. And it's interesting. I mean, even the point you're making about federal funding, it is sort of like what federal funding, but I mean, probably what he's referring to are loans, student loans,
Yeah.
and I think that's one of the things that they've certainly used this past year under the Biden administration as a stick, right, in terms of
Yeah.
trying to force colleges to root out so-called anti-Semitism, which has been anti-Zionist organizing, pro-Palestinian organizing on
Yeah.
campus. And you have those mechanisms that are already being weaponized
Yeah.
under democratic government, going in and then continuing to pull. You mentioned Chris Rufo, of course, DeSantis and Florida and how they're doing this. And the DEI thing, I think, is always fascinating because it's like, for them, when they say that, they just mean people of color. Like, they just mean like that there's that there are people who are diverse, and we should have more white folks as professors and
which we have, which continue to be the overwhelming majority. But yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it's, I think, but also in a way, I think you're right. I think this has something to do with the university protests from the spring. And I think signals like the importance of like organizing on university campuses and to engage in like political and social consciousness awareness and raising. If we think back to like what Columbia sparked in the spring was really important, right? And I think the importance of these student movements from the spring, the importance of it is going to like increase as more time passes by, and historians start to write about this as a turning point in terms of how a broader American public and audience started to maybe rethink U.S. policy, unconditional U.S. support and genocidal policy to support Israeli policy in Palestine. The fact that these university administrators cracked down so hard, right, on these protests says something. It says that like when you're left with just violence and coercion, you've lost the ideological debate. Like there was no effort for persuasion anymore. And if we think about that in like a Gramscian like framework, I mean that there is no more hegemony, right? It's just violence and coercion because we are telling you to accept that this country and these institutions in this country are going to support genocide in Palestine, occupied Palestine. And I think that does fuel some of this. And again, if that's the case, then it's just continuity from the Biden to the Trump administration, and perhaps universities will continue to represent an important area of struggle. But the thing is, now they're much more organized and they're coordinating. Like there was definitely coordination across universities and across the private public division that occurred last summer to anticipate what was to prevent like another spring from happening. And that's one way I read, just from my campus alone, just the level of punitive, like the intensity of the punitive response to 22 or 25 students who tried to set up an encampment last spring. So we'll see. We'll see what's going to happen. We'll see. But I think here in Arizona, I think they're also targeting Ivy Leagues, right? When they talk about endowments, like it's Ivy Leagues who have these massive endowments. So Harvard is just a hedge fund with a university attached to it. Whereas here in Arizona State, we're a real estate company with a university attached to it. But I think what we're facing here is, again, if we go to the local context, there's particular local reactionary forms that will continue to do bad things on campus. Here, we've had to deal with like the local Turning Point chapter. The chapters here in Arizona are particularly powerful because Charlie Kirk lives here, and he's completely plugged into like the state reactionary political network that is not afraid to push back against even some of the programming that we'll try to do at the departmental level at ASU. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, I'm joking about hopefully I have a job. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I shouldn't be so jokey about it. But there's something, I think they view universities as a potential site of resistance for whatever reason, whether it's true or not. And I think you're right. I think they are reacting to what happened to last spring. And again, to get all these stories of people, of students and faculty and staff who are still going through punitive processes like months later, show, I think it's quite revealing as to how U.S. institutions are by and large still willing to fund and to support and to ideologically back genocide in occupied Palestine, but they've lost that argument with the masses in the United States. And what their last resort then is coercion, punishment, violence.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things like that kind of weave through my head around this, because like one, there's this very clear attack on history also, like on historians, which I know is your discipline. But like, because of a lot of what we've talked about today, right? Of like the way that historiography has also developed in, and now we can talk about something like America and have these different discussions of, was this a revolution? Was this a counter revolution? Was it, there's a whole attack on settler colonial studies, of course, the combination people who are looking at Palestine and looking at the US and Australia and making these connections. And there's there was the moment in that video where he talks about this as an attack on Western civilization, and that comes up through all kinds of stuff. But I did a pod a while back where you talked about the coordination of this on campus. Like, this came out from this group, American Council of Trustees and Alumni, and it was sent out to like 200 universities or something like that around the US, and it basically is the whole playbook of preventing occupations and encampments encampments and occupations. And I did a live on it, but it's like, then you look into this group and like they're having these like discussions, and it's all about like defending Western civilization, like that's like the and the guy's a Zionist, and he's having Bernard Henri Levy there to talk about the defense,
showing off his chest hair, huh? Great.
Yeah.
that freak.
So yeah, I mean, it's like these there is this civilizational, again, this is like sort of the connection to the piece that you're talking about, is that yet these civilizational discourses and the way that they are still so alive and well, and this idea of like the hordes and like the unwashed masses and black and brown folks as not really a part of these civilizations, and anyway, I don't know. I mean, I appreciate the piece, and I appreciate you thinking with this question. I just think that in many ways, like, as we think about the kind of coalitions and the kind of organizing and struggle that's going to be needed to combat these different framings, it's just important to kind of also be clear about the sort of ideologies that we're also combating, and how sometimes we also fall into these things too. But yeah, it was anyway, I don't know where I was going with all that, but you made me think of it as we were talking about that.
One of the things that stood out from that brochure as you were scrolling through it is that it said it's a guide for effective governance. And that's also part of it, right? Like, so it's this project to defend quote unquote Western civilization depends on quote unquote effective governments of the unruly masses. So I mean, it's like they're telling us that like settler colonialism doesn't exist; it's a fake thing. But then they use like the models to like thinking about how to govern university spaces. There just recently I saw that Cornell University just hosted a talk with like an IDF veteran who had just come back from like fighting in Gaza, right? But same university went hard after undergraduate and graduate students who had organized pro-Palestine protests and encampments, right? I mean, so it's like, it's such an obvious double standard and obvious hypocrisy at this point. And I think that they know that, and they're just going to be heavy-handed about it, and they're going to use punitive measures to try to push down any sort of challenge to it. One of the things that is happening at my university is that they recently announced that we're going to have like an Institute for Free Speech. We're going to see.
So that comes from these people, by the way. This same group, ACTA. So like you can see They have all their crap online. Like you could
Okay,
see
yeah.
what they're planning, but they'll invite Ann Coulter or somebody like that to your
Mhm.
campus as a part of, like, this is what they do. Or maybe they'll
Yeah,
have
yeah.
Charlie Kirk.
Yeah, they've
So
had him
they
here
were,
several times. Yeah. Yeah.
they're a part of setting up these fake debates where they'll have like a liberal and like a
Mhm.
far right person there, and they're supposed to be modeling how do you do free speech.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
as
it's
they
crazy.
also, as they at the same time are telling, like, how do you not allow any form of public assembly on
Yeah.
campus?
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, and we actually, our university here in the spring prevented Rashida Tlaib from giving a talk. Like they prevented her from giving a talk on campus, and she had to end up. I think she gave the talk over a cell phone that was like connected to a speaker, and then like the people who were assembled on campus were able to hear her comments. Yeah, it's a weird free speech. I mean, it's not free speech, right? Because it's like you have the white supremacists versus the anti-white supremacist person who has to not only argue against white supremacism, but they have to prove like their ontological worth and value as a human being at the same time. It's really odd. It's a really odd framing. But from the university perspective, they can say, well, we just allow everyone, right? And at a public university like mine, they're always concerned about litigation and getting sued. So their thing is just like, well, we just let everyone talk. But then incidents arise when there's a quite obvious double standard, and there is no such thing as free speech. It exists as a concept, but in practice, there's, it's power works through it, and there's inequality built into it, and it's a fake thing. But I think it gives them it gives them an out when it comes toward litigation and facing a lawsuit from any particular group. I mean, it's one of the things that happened during our encampment was that I think it was the county sheriffs who were one of like 4 or 5 police corporations that were brought in, which is ridiculous. They removed the hijab of like 3 women protesters, and I think my university is getting sued over that. A similar lawsuit cost New York City like almost $20 million. So I'm like, this is what you guys are responsible for, because you actually don't respect free speech. Now you may have to pay because you violated the civil rights and the religious rights of these people who are just anti-genocide protesters, which in the end, that's what it's about. We're just protesting against genocide, and that's deemed too radical. That's deemed outside the bounds. Yeah. Anyway, we could talk about this forever.
There's a couple of things I wanted to pull up from questions from folks that were listening. And so always bringing up Puerto Rico, but what do you see as the role of the colonial or of the colony? And what might we expect with this administration? Will it be more neglect and selling off of the island, repression? They also had an election, right, recently,
Yeah.
the governor there. So, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, and the governor who won, the woman is I've seen her described as like a pro-Trump politician, but the Independence Party, I think, had a really good showing, like one of its best, if not its best, electoral showing. So I think that's hopeful. No, I mean, Puerto Rico's a colony, right? And it's always been treated as a colony, and in a way, it's always been it's been treated as a form of laboratory for the kind of policies that the U.S. government has wanted to implement both in the rest of Latin America and even domestically within its own population, right? So it's, in many ways, it's a laboratory for neoliberalism. If you read, oh man, I can't remember his name, How to Hide an Empire. Shoot, I'm like losing the name of this historian. He has a chapter where he talks about how the modern inventor of like chemotherapy, he invented chemotherapy by going to Puerto Rico and like just committing horrific forms of colonial medical malpractice on Puerto Ricans because he could, essentially medical experimentation on Puerto Ricans. And then there's different forms of how this island has served as a neoliberal laboratory, as a police laboratory. So yeah, I mean, this is going to continue. I think if I remember correctly, Trump contemplated trading Puerto Rico for Greenland, right, during his first administration, if I'm not mistaken. So Trump is just much more racist about it, right? Like he doesn't consider Puerto Rico to be in any way, shape, or form part of the United States. And I wouldn't be surprised that like if a good percentage of the population in the U.S. didn't think like him, right? I think many Americans are surprised when they learn that Puerto Ricans are citizens, right? U.S. citizens. But yeah, I think that this, we hopefully Puerto Rico manages to avoid another horrific hurricane, and we don't get images of Donald Trump going over there and shooting paper towels like as if they were basketball to like very desperate people who need a lot of help in the aftermath of a horrific hurricane, which is what happened in his first administration. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think maybe the hope here is that at least through the limits of this electoralism or electoral process, like it was interesting to see that the pro-independence party gained such a big showing. And I think one way to read that is to perhaps think about how dire the situation, or how exploitative, how horrific the colonial relationship has become on the island. But there's a continuity in that as well, right? So
Yeah. Panwa asks if you've heard of this new book, Política Comunal y Autonomía Urbana by Cesar Pineda. Are you aware of this text?
I'm aware of the text and the author, but I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
But it looks really interesting. And Cesar's work, if you guys everyone has Google Translate, but Cesar Pineda is a really interesting, innovative thinker on, I think his background is a sociologist, but politically, I think he's one of the people that I follow the most to try to read the political situation in Mexico from a leftist, but also an independent position relative to the Morena party. And as someone who's interested in questions of autonomy. So he's a really interesting thinker. I just haven't had a chance to read the book, but his work is generally very good. So I would recommend folks follow him on Twitter. And if you don't read Spanish, just hit that translate button. That translate button is like changed my life in a bad way. I think being able to translate some of those Zionist tweets. Oh my God. Anyway, I'll stop there.
What about this book? Carpentiers, El Reino de este Mundo.
It's great. It's a classic of it's about the Haitian Revolution, if I remember correctly, right? And it's one of these, it's usually seen as like one of the foundational pieces of literature for magical realism. So Alejo Carpentier is I think he was a Cuban writer, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I mean, I haven't read that novel in such a long time, but I'm pretty sure it's about the Haitian Revolution. And I mean, all his stuff is amazing. But yeah, I would definitely read that. My favorite my favorite Mexican writer, and they just put out a movie about this novel, and I'm really afraid to watch this movie on Netflix, is the Mexican writer Juan Rulfo. And he has a famous novel, Pedro Páramo, and they just turned it into a movie on Netflix. So I think I might be brave this weekend and finally watch it. But anyway, that's my plug. I always try to tell people about Rulfo because that novel, and he has a collection of short stories called The Burning Plain. It's amazing.
Someone asked, are we seeing wider strength among populations to withstand U.S. client efforts to cause disruptions?
I mean, that's a tough question. I don't know. I mean, I think probably not. But depends on the country in Latin America. So right now, like in a place like Bolivia, we're witnessing just a really like tragic split of the movement towards socialism party between the current president of Bolivia, Luis Arce, and Evo Morales. And it's essentially like a civil war over who gets to run to be president in the next presidential elections. And obviously this is opening up space for the Bolivian right. And, the right in Latin America is, for a long time, the question in Latin America was whether there would be a responsible left who could emerge and govern responsibly, when actually the question all along should have been like, is there a responsible non-fascist right in Latin America that can govern both responsibly and equitably? And what's happening in a place like Bolivia is that this internal splits within this left, within social movements allied to the MAS party, is opening opening the possibility of right-wing intervention. And I think that's a frightening prospect. We saw what happened in Venezuela during their recent electoral campaign. I mean, that country has lost a huge percentage of its population, right, as a consequence of U.S. economic war. So I don't know if I guess we could characterize that as a way of withstanding it. I mean, people have chose to leave as a way to just survive. But I don't know. I mean, we see what's happening in Cuba. Cuba is getting really screwed. I mean, obviously folks probably know that it's been, an embargo against Cuba since the early 1960s, but it's been ratcheted up since the 90s. It was there was a brief moment of aperture during the Obama administration in the mid 2010s, and then Trump comes in and implements a series of horrifically intensified economic sanctions against Cuba that have really hurt the country and the economy, and then compounded by the pandemic, by the COVID pandemic. And Biden, when he was elected, running for office in 2020, was saying that, hey, I'm going to take away these economic war sanctions against both Venezuela and Cuba. But he didn't. He kept them in place. And now we have this dire situation in Cuba where they keep getting like national blackouts, electrical blackouts. I've seen, really dire reports from inside the island that the situation is really difficult. So I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. In a place like Mexico, maybe yes. There you have a overwhelmingly popular political party that is, we'll see if it manages to stave off U.S. intervention in Medellin, because people like Rubio and especially people like Waltz they've been big fans of proposals to like bomb Mexican drug cartels and send in special forces to get rid of them. So we'll see.
Yeah, that was Tori's question here. Do you think the new Mexican president will be able to pull Mexico through Trump's catastrophic plans?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if there's some sort of like U.S. military intervention in Mexico, that's beyond catastrophic. Like I can't even wrap my mind around how awful that would be. And I don't even want to think about it, but the ground has been laid. The ground for this has been prepared all the way back to the first Obama term, when a lot of talk started emerging of Mexico being a failed state. Right. So we've had almost 15 years of U.S. political discourse thinking about Mexico as a failed state, a narco state, a leftist state, a communist state, whatever. So I don't want to imagine like overt military intervention, because that would be, again, it's beyond catastrophic. I think the question, if we manage to avoid that, I think the question is not whether new President Sheinbaum will guide Mexico through the Trump's term, is how she does it. If she does it like the previous president and create some sort of agreement with the U.S. where Mexico serves as the U.S.'s border patrol, that's catastrophic as well in my mind, because Mexico should not be working as the U.S.'s colonial gendarme when it comes to migration and refugees. We should not be setting the U.S.-Mexico border at the Guatemala-Mexico border and doing their dirty work. And we'll see. There's other areas where there's going to be a lot of friction over. I always forget the acronym for the new NAFTA, but there's ongoing negotiations and conflicts over that, because Mexico is trying to do things like implement energy sovereignty that go against the rules of this free trade agreement. So I think it's how President Sheinbaum and the governing party Morena guide Mexico through this term that's going to be important to see. Are they going to play ball with Trump, and are they going to sacrifice some of their ideals in order to do so, like AMLO did, or are they going to do something more confrontational? Because Mexico does have leverage over the United States, and it's a 2,000-mile long border. And it's also economically, like they're so integrated. If the U.S. does something to Mexico economically, they're going to hurt themselves as well.
Yeah, certainly. This question, I don't know if you are familiar with this, but do you know the status of the lawsuit Mexico filed against U.S. arms manufacturers, stating that cartels are terrorizing folks with U.S. arms and munitions from 2022, she believes?
I don't know I wonder if this is something that's going to make it to the U.S. Supreme Court. I don't know what the latest status of it is. I followed it for a while, and there were some lower court victories that Mexico won. And I for some reason, the last round, I feel like they lost in holding U.S. gun manufacturers liable for the violence of the so-called war on drugs in Mexico. But I think it was like, as an effort, I think it was a really original, powerful legal initiative that was well argued by the Mexican government, because it's not a secret. Like, the dynamic that fuels this horrific violence in Mexico is drug demand from the United States, and then then military grade U.S. weaponry flowing south, and that's what keeps a level of violence going that since 2006 has claimed at least 500,000 people's lives, and about 110,000 people disappeared. So yeah, it's just catastrophic numbers.
We should do an episode on that. I think that would be a good
Yeah, for sure.
conversation for us to have in the future, because I think it would be, yeah. I mean, there's some myths to bust around that and some stuff to demystify. Yeah, well, thank you for this, Alex. This has been great. Always good to be with you. And I look forward to having another conversation with you soon.
No, for sure. Thank you so much, Jay. This is always a lot of fun, and thank you for the thoughtful conversation.
Yeah, thank you.